Now we've talked a little bit about how the browser CSS uses specificity to resolve any conflicts. And we talked about that, heading 1 is more specific than a body, but it gets actually much more detailed than that in figuring out specificity. So notice that now we're adding article and an ID, and so our selector's getting much more detailed. And once they start getting detailed, then the specificity starts getting more and more detailed. So the way CSS does it is the specificity is made up of 3 to 5 numbers, and the further left the number is, the more specific it is. So a 1 in this position makes this whole thing more specific than a 1 in this position. And so if one selector has a specificity of 101, it's more specific than one that has 011. So let me show a little bit how these work. There's a kind of a fun way. It's called specificity.com, and we can look at that specificity, and it shows that we have plankton. They're pretty little, and they show up in this very far right one. So they don't have very strong specificity. And that has to do with, and this chart goes from least specific to most specific, and it goes left to right and top to bottom. So the least specific is the asterisk, which just means any element, and it has 0 specificity. And then whenever you have an element in the selector, it shows up, elements are counted in the far right number. So this one has a div, that's 1 element. This one has an li and a ul, and so that adds up to 2. Those are 2 different elements, so it goes to 2. This one, which it doesn't show all of us, but if it had all of these, it has actually 12 elements. So the number gets really big in that right-hand most number. But then along comes a dot class value, and all of a sudden it has higher specificity because classes are tallied in the second number from the right. And remember that it's further left than the elements, so it is stronger. It has more specificity. And so it outweighs these 12 elements. And if we go down to the bottom, it tells us what each of the different numbers are used for. So here, the one in the Z position, the furthest right, is the number of elements. It also includes pseudo elements, which we haven't talked about yet. The one in the middle one, the next right one, is the number of class selectors, attribute selectors. Now we've talked about both of those, right? Class selectors and attribute selectors and pseudo classes. And we haven't used those yet, but those all get counted in the second from the right location. And then the third from the right location is the number of ID selectors. And those are the first 3. The fourth one is an inline style, and it's further left, which means an inline style is more specific than any of the others put together. And then even of more specific is when the exclamation important is added. When that flag's added, then it outranks even inline styles. So that's where you get the 4 and 5 numbers. So let's pay attention to these 3 numbers and see how it grows. Here, class, ones that are counted in the classes are in that second number. And here, the universal one, again, doesn't add anything. This one is an attribute selector where type is equal to checkbox, and that gets a 1 in that second number. And here's a pseudo class that gets a count in the second number. Now this one has li dot my class, right? Class selector. So it has an element that gets counted in the farthest right location, and then a class which gets counted in the middle one. And these two both have the same. This one is an element, the li is the element, and then this is an attribute selector. So the attribute selector gets in the middle number, and the element li gets in the right-hand one. This one has 2 elements and 1 pseudo class, so it gets a 1 and a 2. This one has 2 elements and 1 attribute selector, so it gets a 1 and a 2. This one has a variety of, this one has 1 element, I'm sorry, wrong one. This one has 1 element, that's counted in the right side, and then has 1 class and 1 pseudo class, so those both get counted in the middle number. This one, same thing. So these two have the same specificity. Now this one, if you have a whole bunch of class attributes and class selectors, attribute selectors, and pseudo classes, you can get a whole bunch of them, and they all get counted in that second number from the right. Then comes the ID selector, and it gets counted in the third one from the right, so it makes it more specific than any of these others, no matter how many of the others that you have, because it's in the third from the right, it's further left, and it is more specific. So then you can have an ID selector and also class selectors and element selectors, and so you can keep adding to those for specificity. And notice that our editor, this particular editor Visual Studio Code, if you hover over a selector, it will tell you what the specificity is. This one is a 1 because it has an ID selector. It doesn't have any class selector, so there's a 0 in the next number, and then the last number is a 2 because it has 2 elements, the article and the H1. And remember, more specific, the further left the number is, gives it higher ranking. And it becomes more specific and has higher ranking. And that's how CSS determines which style wins. And it's only an issue when there's a conflict. If there's no conflict, all the styles get applied. But if there's a conflict, if there's 2 different styles that are in conflict with each other, then CSS determines which is more specific, that one gets the styles applied. And that's the selector that's more specific.